Have you ever felt like you're standing on the edge of something invisible, an invisible cliff where beneath lies the unknown and above a fog that won't lift? Anxiety. We speak of it as a curse, a disorder, a burden. But what if it's not? What if anxiety isn't here to break you, but to awaken you? There is a reason your soul stirs uneasily in the silence. There is a reason your chest tightens when you're pretending everything is fine. Anxiety is not always the enemy. It is often the messenger, and like all messengers it will keep knocking, louder, until you answer. Let us explore why your anxiety may be the signal, perhaps the most honest one. You need to begin transforming your life. We are not anxious for no reason. The soul does not tremble without cause. When anxiety rises, it is not a meaningless storm. It is the weather of the psyche, and it is trying to tell you something essential. Modern culture would have you believe that anxiety is simply a flaw in the system, a glitch, a malfunction of the brain to be silenced or chemically erased. But what if this unease is not a malfunction at all? What if it is a signal, a flare from the depths of your unconscious, rising to the surface because it can no longer remain silent? Anxiety is often the voice of the forgotten self. It is the part of you that has been banished to the shadows while your outer life carries on wearing a mask of control, order, and agreement. And like any abandoned part of the psyche, it does not go quietly. Think of a small child left alone in a dark room. At first, they might whisper, cry softly, hoping someone will hear. But when no one comes, they scream, loud, desperate, not because they are dangerous, but because they need to be seen. Your anxiety is that child. It is your own unlived life knocking at the door. There are countless ways we ignore ourselves. We silence our instincts to keep the peace. We choose careers that feed the body but starve the soul. We stay in relationships where we are merely surviving, not thriving. We follow paths mapped out by other people's desires, parents, partners, teachers, society, until one day we look around and realize we are living a life we never truly chose. And it is then that the anxiety appears, not to torment you, but to awaken you. I once spoke with a woman who dreaded Sunday evenings. She didn't understand why. She had a good job, a stable routine, a seemingly normal life. But every Sunday night, as the weekend came to an end, a familiar panic began to rise. Her heart would race, her stomach would turn, and an invisible weight would settle on her chest. For years she ignored it. She assumed she was simply stressed, another victim of the modern pace of life. But the truth was deeper. When she allowed herself to sit with the feeling rather than run from it, she discovered something profound. Her soul was rejecting the role she had been performing. She had become a character in someone else's play. The life she was living did not reflect who she truly was. She had studied law because her father dreamed of it. She had taken a high-paying position because the world deemed it successful. But every fiber of her being longed for creativity, for expression, for depth, for meaning. The Sunday panic wasn't random. It was a spiritual rebellion, a protest from within. And when she began to listen, not react, not suppress, but truly listen, something within her softened. She didn't quit her job overnight. The transformation was not sudden, but it was sacred. She began to write in the evenings. She enrolled in a design course. She made room for the part of herself she had buried. And over time, the panic became quieter, not because life had become easier, but because she was no longer at war with herself. To be anxious is often to be divided. The outer self, what you present to the world, is marching forward, but the inner self, the deeper, truer self, is still waiting at the crossroads. This division creates tension. Anxiety is the rope pulled taut between who you pretend to be and who you truly are. And it is only by turning inward that the rope can loosen. But this turning inward is no small task. It requires courage, the kind of courage most avoid, because what you find there may unsettle the neatness of your current life. It may demand change, and change is frightening, but to refuse this inner calling is to guarantee that anxiety will become your permanent companion. There is a profound difference between distraction and healing. Most people choose distraction. They drown their anxiety in scrolling, in busyness, in alcohol, in toxic positivity, in overachievement, but the soul cannot be tricked. It knows when it is being avoided, and it will wait, patiently, restlessly, until it breaks through the cracks of your carefully constructed life. The work, then, is to become intimate with your own restlessness, to ask, not with judgment but with curiosity, "What are you trying to tell me?" That question alone has the power to open doors you didn't know existed. Perhaps the anxiety is pointing to the fact that you have not been honest with yourself in years. Perhaps it is revealing that your boundaries have been consistently violated, and you no longer know how to say no. Perhaps it is reminding you that the artist in you, the healer, the wanderer, the dreamer, that part of you you buried to fit in, is still alive and waiting to be honored. When you listen to your anxiety, you take the first step toward wholeness. Wholeness is not perfection. It is the integration of all parts of the self, light and dark, joy and grief, desire and fear. The anxious part of you is not a problem to solve. It is a fragment of your psyche, asking to be welcomed home. Many people spend their lives trying to escape discomfort, but in doing so, they also escape themselves. But what if you dared to be uncomfortable for the sake of truth? What if you turned toward the anxiety and said, "I'm ready to hear you"? That willingness alone is revolutionary, because within anxiety lies buried truth, and buried truth, once seen, becomes the foundation for transformation. It may begin with small acts, a conversation you've been avoiding, a dream you've silenced, a truth you finally admit, even if only to yourself. But each act is a declaration. I will no longer abandon myself. And so anxiety, rather than being the enemy, becomes the invitation, the signal, the awakening. In that sense, anxiety is not a sickness. It is a symptom of self-betrayal. And when you begin the work of reclaiming your inner voice, of realigning your outer life with your inner world, you do not become free of anxiety. You become free through it. This is not an easy path. It is not glamorous, but it is holy, because to listen to your anxiety is to finally listen to you. Anxiety is often misunderstood as a purely mental affliction, a disruption of neurochemistry, a malfunction of the brain to be treated or ignored. But if we are willing to look beneath its surface, we may discover that anxiety is far more than a malfunction. It is, in many cases, a sacred messenger, a signal from the unconscious that we are living in contradiction to ourselves. It is the cry of the inner self when the outer life has drifted too far from its center. When we feel anxious without a clear cause, when restlessness and tightness persist even in the absence of danger, it is often not the world that is wrong. It is the misalignment between our soul's truth and the roles we are playing in the world. Imagine walking a path that looks beautiful to others, well paved, respected, adorned with the approval of society, but each step forward feels heavier than the last. You try to convince yourself it's fine. You say, "This is what I'm supposed to be doing." You tell yourself to be grateful, to stay strong, to push through, but something inside you whispers otherwise. That whisper grows louder over time. First, it is a vague sense of unease. Then a persistent fatigue. Eventually it becomes anxiety, a tightening in your chest, a knot in your stomach, a sense that something essential is missing. and often that something is you. You see, anxiety often arises when your outer life, your job, your relationships, your routines, is no longer aligned with your inner truth, when you are living a version of yourself that does not reflect who you truly are. Your psyche begins to resist. It resists through symptoms: restlessness, dread, fatigue, confusion. These are not random. They are expressions of your deeper intelligence trying to get your attention. It is not uncommon to meet people who appear to have it all, yet live with a constant undercurrent of anxiety. They are successful by every measure: wealth, status, appearance, but they cannot sleep at night, they cannot breathe fully. Why? Because their lives have been built upon an image, not an essence. They are performing roles, fulfilling expectations, living out a script handed to them by family, culture, or fear. Their anxiety is not the problem. It is the proof that their soul is still alive, refusing to go quietly into that inauthentic existence. We are born with a certain essence, a unique constellation of values, gifts, sensitivities, and longings. When we are young, this essence is vibrant, visible, raw. Children know what they love. They know what excites them and what scares them. They live close to their inner world, but as we grow, we are trained to trade that inner clarity for outer approval. We are told, directly or indirectly, to abandon our truth in exchange for belonging. We are taught to become who we are expected to be, not who we are meant to be. This is the beginning of the split, and anxiety, later in life, is often the echo of that split. Ask yourself, are your values aligned with your daily actions? Do you speak words you believe in, or words that will keep the peace? Are your dreams buried beneath obligations and shoulds? Have you abandoned your creativity, your curiosity, your capacity for wonder, in exchange for predictability and control? Do you even recognize the person you've become? These are not easy questions, but they are essential ones, because until we are willing to examine the life we are living, and whether it reflects our true self, we will remain anxious. The psyche cannot thrive in falsehood. It will not allow you to remain in misalignment without protest, and that protest, again, is your anxiety. There was a man I once met who had spent 20 years in corporate finance. On the surface, he had done everything right. He had climbed the ladder, provided for his family, earned admiration from his peers, but privately he was suffering. His days felt like a performance. His weekends were filled with dread. His body carried a constant weight he couldn't explain. After a long and painful inner reckoning, he admitted to himself that he had never truly wanted that life. He had a passion for teaching, for mentoring, for helping young people find their path. But he had silenced that desire long ago, believing it to be impractical, foolish, soft. His anxiety, it turned out, was not random. It was the pressure of his suppressed self trying to break through. Real transformation began when he stopped trying to numb his anxiety and instead began to listen to it. Slowly, he made space in his life for what was real. He volunteered. He started writing. He began teaching part-time. Eventually, he made a full transition, not without fear, not without difficulty, but with integrity, and the anxiety began to shift. It didn't disappear entirely, but it changed shape. It became energy. Vitality, a sense of direction. This is what happens when we begin to live in alignment. The symptoms quiet because the soul is finally being heard. Alignment is not about perfection. It is not about creating a life without discomfort or challenge. It is about coherence, harmony between your inner world and your outer expression, when your values guide your choices, when your heart and your hands move in the same direction, when you stop betraying yourself for the sake of fitting in. In that space, peace is possible, not the shallow peace of avoidance, but the deep peace of authenticity. To live in alignment requires courage. It asks you to question what you've accepted, to let go of roles that no longer serve you, to risk disapproval in favor of self-respect, but the alternative is far more dangerous. To live out of alignment is to suffer a slow erosion of the soul. It is to wake up one day and realize you have lived someone else's life, and that it is too late to reclaim your own. But it is not too late. It never is. That is the gift hidden inside the anxiety. It is not punishing you. It is prompting you. It is asking you to come home to yourself. It is inviting you to remember who you were before the world told you who you had to be. You don't have to change everything overnight. You don't have to tear down your life all at once. But you must begin. Begin by listening. Begin by being honest. Begin by asking yourself what matters most, and whether you are living in alignment with that truth. Anxiety is not your enemy. It is the light on the dashboard, the warning signal that says, something here is not working. Do not curse the signal, use it. Let it guide you not into fear, but into truth. Let it lead you step by step, choice by choice, back into alignment with your soul. Anxiety, so often feared, medicated, and misunderstood, is in many cases not a symptom of weakness or disease, but the pressure of transformation. It emerges at the threshold where your current self begins to outgrow its shape. It is the soul's way of alerting you that who you are today is no longer large enough to contain what you are becoming. In that sense, anxiety is not just an emotion. It is a signal, a tension in the psyche. It tells us that the container of the known our habits, beliefs, relationships, roles, has begun to crack under the weight of our emerging potential. And just like the seed that must split to allow the sprout to emerge, we too must allow ourselves to fracture before we can grow. There is a sacred discomfort that comes with becoming. It is not comfortable, nor is it meant to be. Real growth, the kind that demands a new identity, a new way of being in the world, always begins with unease. The familiar becomes stifling. The routines lose their meaning. The roles we once wore proudly now feel like costumes. We feel restless, agitated, uncertain, and underneath it all, anxiety. But not anxiety born from failure. No, this is the anxiety of possibility, the trembling before flight, the ache of potential not yet expressed. I have met many who have stood on this invisible threshold, unable to name what they're feeling, only knowing that something deep within is stirring. A young woman on the verge of leaving a relationship that had long since stopped nurturing her spirit told me, "I feel like I can't breathe, but I'm terrified to walk away." Another man, successful by all conventional standards, confessed that he lay awake at night, heart racing, unsure why he felt so empty. What united these people was not a flaw in their character, but a truth rising from within. They were being called to grow, called to become, and their anxiety was the echo of that call. Many of us encounter this anxiety at life's crossroads, when considering a new job, moving to a new city, ending a long-standing relationship, changing our path entirely. We are told to be brave, to take the leap, but rarely are we taught that the fear we feel in those moments is not weakness. It is not a sign that we are doing something wrong. Quite the opposite. It is the friction of transformation. The resistance we feel is not always a warning. Sometimes it is an initiation. There is a moment in every story where the hero must leave the familiar behind, not because they are ready, but because staying would mean spiritual death. They must walk into the unknown, into the dark forest, into the fire, not because they want to suffer, but because they know, deep down, that their life depends on it. This is not just a mythic story. It is our story. And the anxiety we feel in those moments is the threshold guardian. It stands between who we have been and who we might become, demanding that we earn our evolution. To ignore this call is to remain in the shell. Safe, predictable, but stagnant. The shell may protect you from risk, but it also blocks you from growth. It is the barrier between the life you know and the life that is waiting for you. But no seed becomes a tree by staying whole. No soul expands by clinging to safety, and so anxiety becomes the spiritual pressure that forces us to choose, remain and shrink, or risk and grow. I once met a man who came to me with a simple complaint. He couldn't sleep. His heart raced at night. He would wake with a sense of urgency but couldn't name the source. Everything is fine, he kept saying, there's nothing wrong, but the psyche rarely lies, and when we opened the space for his deeper self to speak, the truth emerged. He was starving, not physically, not financially, but spiritually. He had spent years living efficiently, but not meaningfully. He had followed the rules, done everything expected of him, and yet his soul was parched. Not for comfort, but for purpose. So he began where many of us must begin, not with a grand gesture, but with a small act of realignment. He started volunteering once a week, offering time to something that stirred his spirit. He began writing, pouring his thoughts into words he never thought would matter. He opened himself not to certainty, but to movement, and from there something shifted. His anxiety didn't disappear, it transformed. What once felt like panic now became energy, direction, vitality. What once woke him with dread now roused him with urgency. The symptoms remained, but they had changed their nature. They no longer screamed for escape. They pointed toward becoming. This is the alchemy of the soul. When we honor our inner expansion, when we stop resisting the discomfort of change and start leaning into it, our anxiety becomes a guide, a force not of destruction, but of creation. It pushes us forward not because we are broken, but because we are too big for the life we are currently living. But this transformation requires honesty, brutal, soul-level honesty. It demands that we stop asking, "How can I make this feeling go away?" and instead ask, "What is this feeling trying to become?" Because you are not afraid of failing, not really. Most of us can survive failure. What we fear, what truly terrifies us, is success. The kind of success that forces us to step into a version of ourselves we've never met. The kind that strips away our excuses. The kind that demands we live fully. That trembling you feel before a big decision. That weight in your chest before taking the leap. It's not weakness. It's not pathology. It's potential trying to be born through the cracks of your old self, and it will keep pressing, keep pulsing until you respond. You can ignore it, yes. You can return to comfort, distract yourself, numb yourself. But the cost is high, because what you avoid today will become the regret of tomorrow. The soul is not interested in your comfort. It is interested in your wholeness. It is not concerned with whether you feel safe. It is concerned with whether you are alive. And sometimes anxiety is its most faithful servant, not because it brings peace, but because it brings truth, because it refuses to let you shrink, because it calls you to fly, even when your wings still tremble. You are not broken because you feel anxious at the edge of your life. You are becoming. The path is hard. The fire is real, but on the other side of that fire is you, not the version shaped by fear, but the one shaped by purpose. And your anxiety, it's simply the heat of that transformation. So feel it, listen to it, and most of all, let it move you forward. Anxiety, though unpleasant, is often the honest whisper of the soul, a whisper that rises when the noise of the world grows quiet enough for us to finally hear what we've been avoiding. We spend so much of our lives constructing facades, projecting images, and suppressing the parts of ourselves that feel inconvenient, painful, or unworthy. and in doing so, we cast into the shadow all that does not fit the mask we wear. But the psyche is not fooled. What is repressed is not erased. The denied does not disappear. It waits patiently in the dark corners of our being until the time comes when it can no longer be ignored. And often that time is marked by anxiety. We are conditioned to believe that if we simply push away pain long enough, it will vanish. But the truth is that the things we repress, our unresolved grief, our childhood wounds, our anger, our guilt, these things do not die. They simply go underground, and there, in the unconscious, they grow in silence. They influence our behavior, our choices, our relationships. They shape our fears and color our thoughts, and eventually they rise. Not to destroy us, but to be seen. Anxiety is not always a reaction to what is happening in the world around us. Sometimes it is a reaction to what is happening within us. It is the body's way of signaling that something long hidden is surfacing. It is not random, it is not meaningless, it is often the beginning of an inner confrontation. The first sign that the shadow is stirring. The shadow is not evil. It is not some dark force to be feared. The shadow is simply the part of you that you have not yet dared to face. It is your unintegrated self, the emotions you were told were wrong, the parts of your personality you were taught to be ashamed of, the instincts you suppressed to be accepted. These pieces, when denied, take root in the unconscious, and they wait for silence, for stillness, for cracks in the armor of your persona. Have you noticed how anxiety tends to creep in during moments of quiet? When you lie in bed at night, when the distractions are gone, when the world is asleep and you are alone with yourself, that is when the shadow appears. That is when the repressed begins to rise. And the anxiety you feel in those moments is not just fear, it is exposure. The curtain has lifted. The parts of you you've tried to bury are standing in the light. We often distract ourselves to avoid this very moment. We fill our days with noise, with tasks, with screens and schedules. Because deep down we fear what we might find in the silence. But silence is not the enemy, it is the gateway. It is the space in which truth can finally speak. And when anxiety rises in that space, it is not a curse. It is a gift. A painful, inconvenient, but necessary gift. Because it means something within you is ready to be acknowledged. There is a profound intelligence in the timing of the soul. Our shadows do not surface when we are too fragile to meet them. They appear when we are strong enough to begin the work, when we are ready to hold what once felt unbearable. That readiness may not feel like confidence. It may feel like panic, like trembling, like an overwhelming urge to run. But these reactions are not indicators of failure. They are the signs that something real is occurring, that the unconscious is opening, that healing is beginning. I have spoken with people who, for years, carried anxiety with no clear cause. They had no trauma they could name, no catastrophe they could point to, and yet the anxiety persisted. It was only when they allowed themselves to go deeper, not to the past alone, but into the hidden rooms of their psyche, that clarity emerged. One man, successful and respected, shared that his anxiety would flare every time he was alone. After much exploration, he uncovered a childhood belief that his worth was tied only to his productivity, that stillness equaled laziness, and laziness equaled shame. In the quiet, his shadow rose, the part of him that longed to rest, to be, to exist without proving. That part had been exiled for so long that its return came in the form of anxiety, but once acknowledged, it brought not destruction, but integration. Another woman carried years of anxiety around intimacy. She could not understand why vulnerability made her skin crawl, but beneath her anxiety was a hidden grief, molten, ancient, long suppressed. As a child, She had learned that love was conditional, that closeness came with pain. Her anxiety was not irrational. It was a message from the part of her that had been hurt and never healed. It rose not to sabotage her, but to protect her, and in seeing it for what it was, she could finally begin to grieve, to forgive, to open again. This is the work the shadow asks of us, not judgment, but presence, not perfection, but wholeness. And wholeness only comes when we are willing to reclaim what we have lost, to welcome home the parts of ourselves we turned away from in fear or shame. The journey is not linear, it is not clean. There will be resistance and there will be sorrow, but there will also be liberation. For every part of you that was denied, there is a corresponding strength waiting to be restored. The child who was told to be quiet may hold the voice of an artist. The one who was shamed for being emotional may possess the gift of deep empathy. The person who was taught to suppress anger may carry within them the fire to create justice. The shadow is not just pain, it is also potential, and when we dare to turn toward it, we reclaim not just our buried wounds, but our buried wisdom. Anxiety, in this light, becomes a threshold. It is the moment before the integration. The tension before the breakthrough. When we resist it, it becomes louder, sharper, more overwhelming. But when we welcome it, it begins to shift. It loses its grip. It becomes a guide. This is the paradox of healing. What we fear the most is often the very thing we need to face in order to be free. And anxiety, far from being a flaw, is often the soul's alarm bell, telling us that it is time. Time to stop running, time to turn inward, time to sit with the discomfort and ask, with compassion and courage, what have I refused to see? In doing so, we begin the true work of transformation, not through escape, but through integration. And it is only when we integrate the shadow that we begin to feel whole. The anxiety may not vanish overnight. It may linger, soften, return in waves, but its message will have been heard, its purpose fulfilled. And in that we find not just relief, but awakening. We discover that healing does not come by pushing parts of ourselves away, but by bringing them home. There comes a time in the unfolding of our psyche when we are no longer able to wear the mask we've spent years constructing. That mask, crafted from expectations, fears, projections, and adaptations, once served us well. It allowed us to belong, to survive, to navigate the early stages of life without disruption. But eventually, the soul grows restless within such limitations. The anxiety you feel is not merely a defect to be fixed or a signal of weakness. It is the cry of the self that has outgrown its current form. Every true transformation begins with a kind of death, but unlike the physical ending we so fear, this death is a psychological one. It is the dissolution of an identity that has become too small, too brittle, too confined to contain the vastness of who you are becoming. That anxiety you carry, that strange restlessness that keeps you awake at night or follows you like a shadow through your day, is not simply a nuisance. It is the sound of your old identity cracking under the weight of your potential. The self that longs to be born cannot coexist peacefully with the self you are trying to preserve. One must surrender for the other to emerge. This is the paradox. You are both the sculptor and the stone. You are both the wounded one and the healer, and your anxiety, though you may resent it, has come not to harm you, but to awaken you. It is the summons to a deeper life. Ask yourself, who would I be without this fear? Not in some abstract or theoretical sense, but truly, what parts of me have I silenced to remain acceptable, to feel safe, to avoid conflict or rejection? Who did I have to become to receive love, and what parts of me did I exile in the process? I once encountered a young man who had been paralyzed by anxiety for years. His hands trembled in social settings. He seconded, guessed his every word. He nodded in agreement with opinions he did not share. On the surface, he appeared agreeable, polite, and obedient, traits that made him well liked, yet left him hollow inside. Beneath that quiet exterior lived a storm of untapped emotion. He was, in truth, an artist, a man with sharp perceptions, intense feelings, and a fierce longing to express beauty, chaos, and depth. But he had been told, again and again, directly and indirectly, that such parts of him were too much. So he learned to dim his light. He folded his fire into anxiety. He wore meekness as armor, but the soul is not a prisoner for long. It finds a way to speak. In his case, it whispered through panic attacks, insomnia, and an unshakable sense that he was suffocating, despite nothing being visibly wrong. This, too, is the paradox. The more inauthentic our lives become, the more our body begins to revolt. Anxiety, then, is not merely a malfunction. It is the revolt of the real self. Once he allowed himself to explore the creative force within him, through writing, through painting, through the unapologetic claiming of his voice. The tremors began to calm. His anxiety did not vanish overnight. But its sharpness softened, because he was no longer repressing his nature. He was no longer at war with the man he truly was. We all wear masks. It is necessary in early development. But we must not mistake the mask for the face. The persona is a useful tool, but when we cling to it beyond its season, it becomes a prison, and anxiety is often the symptom of that imprisonment, the soul gasping for air, for authenticity, for alignment. This process of transformation is not comfortable. It will ask you to let go of your old stories, the ones that say, "I am always the helper," or "I must keep everyone happy," or "I'm not meant to succeed." These stories were written by the frightened self, the conditioned self, the self trying to avoid pain. But now, as you feel the stirrings of something deeper, those stories begin to unravel. And as they unravel, you will feel fear, not because you are broken, but because you are crossing the threshold of identity. No one teaches us how to die psychologically, but that is what anxiety prepares us for. Not the end of life, but the end of who you thought you had to be. It is the deep and necessary disintegration that precedes renewal. In myth, this is the descent into the underworld, the shedding of armor, the confrontation with the unconscious, the painful, glorious rebirth into authenticity. Your anxiety might ask, what if I disappoint people? What if they no longer recognize me? And it's true, some will not. But others will finally see you clearly, and more importantly, you will finally see yourself. Creating a new identity does not mean becoming someone else. It means allowing what is already within you to emerge. It means stepping into a fuller version of your essence, unapologetic, creative, honest, and whole. It means saying yes to the life that calls you, even if that life bears no resemblance to the one you are currently living. Let me tell you, the moment you stop resisting who you are becoming is the moment the anxiety begins to shift. It may still be present, but it will feel less like an enemy and more like a guide, less like a storm and more like a compass, because anxiety, at its root, is the soul's signal that you are misaligned with your becoming. When you honor this call, your life will not suddenly become easy, but it will become true, and in truth there is peace, not the peace of comfort, but the peace of purpose, and that is the greatest gift anxiety can give you, the push toward a more authentic, expansive self. So if you are trembling, uncertain, aching, do not retreat, lean in. Ask not how to get rid of your anxiety, but what it has come to reveal. You may find that it is not the obstacle at all, but the doorway. A doorway to a self you've long forgotten, a self waiting patiently to rise. So yes, anxiety hurts, it suffocates, it confuses. But beneath the pain lies a message. You are being called to transform, not into something you're not, but into who you've always been. Anxiety is not a curse, it is a compass, a spiritual GPS that says you are off track, but you can come home. So don't run from your anxiety. Sit with it, listen to it, because sometimes the discomfort you're trying to escape is the doorway to your greatest freedom.